Marilyn Monroe is one of the most studied women in psychology, and I think the reason for that is not what most people assume. It is not just because she was famous, or because she died young, or because her life had a tragic quality that made good storytelling. It is because her story sits at the intersection of something almost every woman has experienced at some point, which is the gap between who the world has decided you are and who you actually are when nobody is watching. And in Marilyn's case, that gap was so wide and so deliberately constructed and so ultimately painful that psychologists, biographers, and cultural critics have spent 6 decades trying to fully understand it. Welcome back to Iconic Her. Today we are going underneath the icon, underneath the blonde hair and the white dress and the breathy voice, to find the real psychological story of the woman born Norma Jeane Mortensen, what she survived, what she built, what it cost her, and what she understood about femininity and power and presence that the world is still studying today. So with that said, let us get into it. She was born to a mother with undiagnosed schizophrenia and an essentially non-existent father, and she spent much of her childhood moving between orphanages and foster homes, seeking out any semblance of familial stability she could find. 11 foster homes in total. In one foster home, she was sexually abused, fondled by a lodger at just 8 years old. And she has written that some of her foster families used to send her to the movies to get her out of the house, and she would sit there all day and way into the night. And I think about that image a lot, a little girl sitting alone in a dark cinema watching people on screen be loved and chosen and seen. And I think it explains something about who Marilyn Monroe eventually became. Because the woman who built one of the most magnetic screen presences in cinema history had spent her childhood watching screens and learning, completely intuitively, what made a person impossible to look away from, and she married at 16 simply to escape the foster care system, which tells you everything about how few options the world had given Norma Jeane. And what is worth sitting with from this part of her story is not the sadness of it, but what it built in her. Because a childhood defined by instability and the desperate need to be chosen and kept teaches a person things about human psychology that no classroom ever could, specifically about what makes people feel safe, what makes them feel wanted, what makes them lean in rather than pull away. And Norma Jeane learned all of it by needing it so completely and so consistently that she became an expert in it before she was old enough to name what she knew. When she signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox in 1946, they gave her a new name and a new image and essentially a new identity. And what is fascinating about what happened next is not that the studio constructed Marilyn Monroe. It is that Norma Jeane took that construction and made it completely and specifically her own, because she studied it, she worked at it. She developed every element of the Marilyn persona with the seriousness of someone who understood that this was not just a character she was playing, but a psychological instrument she was building, and the specific elements she developed, the voice, the walk, the softness, the eye contact, the way she made every person she spoke to feel like the most important person in the room, were not accidents or natural gifts. They were practiced and refined and deliberately chosen. And Arthur Miller, one of the greatest playwrights in American history, described her in private recordings as a very smart woman with a terrific sense of humor, irony, and generosity, which is completely different from the dumb blonde the world had decided she was. And she owned 400 books at the time of her death and was often photographed with a book. She studied acting seriously at the Actors Studio alongside some of the most respected performers of her generation. She had her own production company, and she said herself that Arthur Miller would not have married her if she had been nothing but a dumb blonde. And what all of that tells you is that Marilyn Monroe was a woman who had built a specific public persona with enormous intelligence, and then watched the world take that persona and use it to dismiss the very intelligence she had used to create it. And that specific irony of being underestimated by the thing you built to make yourself seen is one of the most psychologically interesting things about her entire story. Here is the part of Marilyn's psychology that I find most important and most relevant to our own lives, which is what happens to a person when the gap between their public self and their private self becomes too wide to maintain. Because Marilyn Monroe, the persona, was radiant and soft and warm and effortlessly magnetic. And Norma Jeane underneath was still the little girl who had grown up in 11 foster homes, still trying to understand why she was so consistently hard to keep. And those two realities lived inside the same body for her entire career, and the weight of maintaining that distance, of being one thing completely in public and something much more fragile in private, is something that psychologists now understand as a significant contributor to the emotional exhaustion she experienced. Because performing a version of yourself that is not fully connected to who you actually are requires an enormous amount of energy, and the more successful the performance, the more the world reinforces it. And the more the world reinforces it, the harder it becomes to let anyone see past it. And Marilyn has said that no one ever told her she was pretty when she was a little girl. And I think that line contains more of her story than almost anything else. Because it tells you that all the adoration and all the fame and all the men who wanted her and all the audiences who loved her never fully reached the part of her that had been Norma Jeane, the part that had grown up waiting to be chosen and kept and told she was worth staying for, and the lesson that sits inside that is not about fame or celebrity. It is about something much more personal and much more universal, which is that external validation, however loud and however constant, cannot fill the specific space that was created by the absence of love at the beginning of your life. It simply cannot reach that place. And the women who understand that and build their sense of worth from the inside rather than waiting for the outside to provide it are the ones who last. Despite everything, and I want to be clear that there is a lot to hold in this story at once, Marilyn Monroe understood something about feminine power and influence that most people in her industry never figured out, which is that softness is not weakness, that vulnerability does not reduce your magnetism, it increases it. That making people feel protective toward you is a form of power that aggression and dominance can never replicate, and she built her entire presence around this understanding. The gentle voice, the warmth, the specific quality of attention she gave people that made them feel genuinely seen, the way she moved through a room as if she had all the time in the world and was genuinely delighted to be exactly where she was. And the reason this worked so completely is something psychologists call the protection effect, which is that when someone combines genuine vulnerability with genuine warmth, they trigger something very deep in the people around them, a desire to be close to them, to protect them, to be the person they choose. And Marilyn activated that response in almost everyone she met, in audiences who had never met her, in men who should have known better, in women who recognized something real in her that the screen image was only partially showing. And what she teaches us about presence and magnetism is something worth carrying into our own lives, which is that the parts of yourself you are most tempted to hide, the softness, the uncertainty, the genuine emotion, the things that feel too vulnerable to show in a world that rewards toughness, are often the exact things that make you most impossible to forget, because people do not remember perfect, they remember real, and Marilyn was real in a way that the world had never quite seen before, and has never quite seen since. Marilyn Monroe died at 36 years old, and the world spent the next 6 decades studying her, writing about her, making films about her, analyzing her, because she left behind something that most icons do not, which is a genuinely unresolved question. The question of who she actually was underneath everything she built, and I do not think that question has a clean answer. I think she was both things completely, both Marilyn and Norma Jeane, both the most magnetic woman in the room and the little girl who is still waiting to feel like she deserved to be there. And the reason her story matters for us is not the tragedy of it, but the specific truth it contains, which is that the image you present to the world and the person you are in private are both real. And when the distance between them becomes too great, something breaks. And the work of a life is not to build the most impressive version of yourself for other people to admire, but to close that distance, to become someone whose public self and private self are close enough to each other that you do not have to spend your energy maintaining the gap. And Marilyn never fully got there, and the world loved her for what she showed them and missed her for what she never got to become. And what she leaves behind is both a lesson in the extraordinary power of femininity and presence, and a reminder that none of it means anything if the person inside is still waiting to be told they were worth staying for. Stay iconic.